This episode is a bit of a personal one. It's one that I happened to be in the area of central Alberta for a little while, and I really didn't want to miss out on the opportunity to get. So this one is going to focus around a very good, dear friend and longtime training partner of mine, Logan Bruneau. Now, for anybody who has listened to the Because Jitsu podcast, you'll know him as a returning guest. He's actually a very popular one on there because I bring him on to talk primarily about martial arts history. And he has an absolute wealth of knowledge on that topic. In fact, you could talk to him forever, and I always try to get hours out of him when he's around to talk about it, whether it's ancient history, medieval history, whether it's modern history or semi-modern history. Doesn't matter if it's karate, doesn't matter if it's taekwondo, doesn't matter if it's Korean, Japanese, Brazilian, jiu-jitsu. He's got some incredible knowledge that he's spent basically a lifetime cultivating. But there's this cool thing where he himself is part of history in this strange way. He's part of the central Alberta history. And if you track it back just one step in his generational lineage, his father is actually a very big part of Alberta martial arts history long before Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu really hit that part of the world. So I took myself down to Innisfail, Alberta, to a very old and pretty well known, at least by word of mouth, martial arts school called...
This is the training area. This is where the magic happens.
The Chinese Boxing Connection.
We opened this in 1999, so it's going to be 21 years, although we were closed for about 5. Yep, it's definitely seen better days. The mat used to be flat. He would have started back in the early 70s. I'm going to say, if I remember, shortly after Bruce Lee's death, so yeah, maybe 1973. So yeah, when we first built the gym, we didn't build it using like tatami or soft padded grappling mats. We use these rubber composite mats that are designed for stock trailers because the business down below is a trailer business. So we use the stock trailer mats as this hard surface that we could train on. By today's standards, way too hard, unrealistically hard. In fact, I can't even believe that I was required to roll on a surface like this, but we got thrown on it on a daily basis, so I was used to it. When I was a kid, I thought that these mats were soft. Really? So I think that it's all about conditioning. It's about mental conditioning. It wasn't until I got used to training on like a judo floor that I thought that these mats were too hard, right? Also, when I was 16, I traveled overseas to Vietnam and I saw people practicing martial arts on cobblestones, and these guys were taking like full height falls onto cobblestones, right? So that was hardcore to me. This was soft in comparison.
So after he showed me around and he gave me the tour, we sat down and chatted in depth about the history that he has, the history his father had, and interestingly, the history that he is going to be producing in the same location moving forward. You're usually the guy that I talk to when it comes to martial arts history, and I find it endlessly entertaining, endlessly interesting when it comes to like ancient stuff back in like ancient Rome, Greece, China, especially Japan. You've done a lot of research on that. But some of the more interesting stuff I haven't heard a whole lot of is actually what happened here in central Alberta, and your dad is a giant sort of nexus point of what's happened in central Alberta specifically when it came to martial arts. So do you want to like take us back to how your dad got into martial arts? Because you're a second generation martial artist yourself. You're born into it. Your dad was a gym owner.
That's right.
Take us back to the year, how it started, and sort of progress us through the decades a bit.
So yeah, my dad started learning martial arts in the early 70s. I think he just picked up. He was a farm boy from northern Saskatchewan, so he didn't really know what martial arts was, but he was naturally very tough, and liked to fight. One day he was walking through, I think, either downtown Calgary or Edmonton, and passed by a karate school. And he saw them practicing like fighting techniques inside and wanted to know all about it. So he started up right away and was hooked. So I think he would have been probably 19 years old at the time. And within a year or two of teaching, he was already like training the beginners. And at that time, it was Simon's, I believe it would have been known as Temple Kung Fu, because it was the 70s, and this is after Bruce Lee. And when you look at like the Western world and our pop culture towards martial arts, that's when it started to explode under the movie scene with Bruce Lee. Yeah. And prior to that, there was karate and there was judo, and probably taekwondo as well. But it was really with kung fu movies that like martial arts became a major aspect of media culture. Yeah, would you say that Bruce Lee was to kung fu or striking arts at that time what the UFC was to mixed martial arts in the 90s? Yeah, I would say so too. You wouldn't really have one without the other. Exactly, yeah. Actually, some people even refer to Bruce Lee as like one of the grandfathers of modern mixed martial arts. I wouldn't say that. He's not the grandfather of the UFC by any means. I think Dana White kind of used that as a marketing gimmick to like pull all the traditional martial artists to become UFC fans, but he definitely was a pioneer in modernizing and hybridizing martial arts. So with the style that my dad was training, I believe it was Temple Kung Fu under Master Simon. And I think that the reason he called it Kung Fu, I think the reason that the instructor called it Kung Fu was because of the popularity of Kung Fu, because like prior to that he was calling it karate. Okay. And then sometime in the 80s... So there wasn't a real understanding of the difference between the two in the general populace? No, but when Kung Fu first became popular over karate because of Bruce Lee, the idea was that Kung Fu was more fluid. That there was karate was like linear and overly hard, and Kung Fu was softer and faster and more fluid and packed internal power, if you will, right? So there's a lot of mysticism behind it. It was something that was new, although everyone knew it was also ancient, and so that kind of Oriental mysticism that came with it was very popular, right? Bruce Lee was very popular. Then I think in the 80s, when the Karate Kid became popular, I think karate kind of like had a revolution in the 80s in media culture. So there's a lot more karate going on in the 80s in pop culture. But so my dad had trained Kempo, like Kempo-oriented karate, and also Tai Lu Chuan Fa, which is a style of Kung Fu that he had learned in Las Vegas from an instructor down there. He had also trained even under Judo Gene Lebell. Oh, no kidding. Yeah, so back in the 70s, early 80s, when he was traveling North America, living down in Los Angeles, he would have trained with Judo Gene, along with some movie stars and some more other famous martial artists. Rubbed shoulders with Jackie Chan at one point in his career. What I'm noticing, though, is that there is a whole lot of what you're already referring to as hybridization between different styles. You're talking about multiple styles that your dad was training either simultaneously or in conjunction with each other. That's right. And in a previous episode that we've covered, the Genki Jiu-Jitsu story had a very similar feel to that, in that during the beginning stages of a grassroots movement when it comes to any sort of thing, but since we're on the topic of martial arts, it's what it is. You take what you can from where you can get it and make the best of it. And it's interesting to see the parallels between those two, because later on, we'll get to this when we get to your side of the story, but you would actually start training where I was training at Genki Jiu-Jitsu. Yeah, that's right. It's just another step in the evolution. And back in the 70s and 80s, martial arts resources were very limited in Western Canada. It was much more popular in Los Angeles or Las Vegas or New York. So my dad was working overseas, so he would train in Asia or the Orient whenever he got a chance to, but especially down in Los Angeles, which was a hub of martial arts in the 70s. That's where he did a lot of the more famous training. Because of Hollywood, you think? Because of Hollywood, definitely, yeah. I mean, Judo Gene Lebell was famous because he was teaching Hollywood actors and stuntmen. Like the Higan Machado of his day. That's right, yeah. And Judo Gene was probably one of the most legitimate grapplers back then, too. But grappling wasn't seen as, most people didn't even consider it under the list of martial arts. Styles like judo, wrestling, yeah, they weren't as flashy. People thought that if you could do a high kick, that was sort of the epitome of what a martial artist was supposed to be able to do. But honestly, at the end of the day, actually my dad apparently, anecdotally told me about a street scrap that he was involved in after he had started learning martial arts. So he was already a fairly adept striker. Like it was full contact karate, so it wasn't a bullshit karate style.
Any of the karate styles from like the 70s tend to be pretty hard nosed.
Yeah, that's right. It's karate like prior to the 80s was usually full contact and usually more practical before it was watered down in the point sport karate world. But even still, he got in a fight with this guy and he ended up on the ground. And the guy, at that point, the fight was neutralized and he felt like he was losing the fight on the ground. He survived the fight, but afterwards, and this was back in the early 80s, afterwards he really started like thinking about the fact that he had been training martial arts for years. But as soon as that fight hit the ground, he was like a fish out of water. Yeah. Right? And that was still years before Royce Gracie exploded onto the scene with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and UFC 1. But it should have been foreshadowing the future of martial arts and what the major gaping holes that were missing in martial arts.
Yeah, and one of the things that your dad would eventually start incorporating into his training regimen here with his students were grappling ground options, right?
Yeah, that's right. So he wanted to have the most modern, the ultimate fighting system. And incorporating jiu-jitsu was a natural progression of that, right? So from Judo Gene Lebell, he was learning catch wrestling and judo, which you could consider an aspect of jiu-jitsu. And he also trained at Genki too back in the 90s.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. He was training a little bit. I remember as a kid the name Genki Jiu-Jitsu when I was probably 5, 6 years old.
There you go. Like Dave was saying, he started in '95 under his instructor. And Daryl, at that point, who was instructing Dave, it was Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, but he had his own school called Genki Jiu-Jitsu, and that Dave would eventually... oh, no, wait a sec. I don't believe that Dave was the one that made the name Genki, but he would take over the program from Daryl as Daryl phased himself out into the 2000s.
And I remember it being called Genki back then too, yeah.
So we've talked about the beginning inception. We didn't even get into... Quick little side note here for the interested history fans is if we're talking about decades starting in the 60s and then the 70s when your dad came on to the 80s where karate started popping off into the 90s where people started realizing they needed jiu-jitsu. Before we get to the end of the 80s and into the 90s, let's talk a little bit about the 60s that we kind of brushed over with the actual like beginning nexus point of where the martial arts that your dad learned started in central Alberta. A little bit about, what was his name again?
Master Simon.
Simon, yeah, it's super interesting to me.
It is a very interesting story, and it's riddled with controversy. Anybody who's been in the martial arts world in Western Canada for that long will definitely have heard of him. Mm-hmm. I actually know guys that are in their 40s that have been training martial arts since they were a kid that know about him, or their fathers, if they're second generation, know about him. And today he's widely seen as a fraud or a con artist, because if you look up any information about him online, there's all kinds of what would you say is contradicting truths about who he was as a man and what his lineage was. But from what I know, from what I've read from mostly people that he was around when he came to Canada, is he was a German immigrant that came to Canada after World War II. He was a boxer in Germany, and he had some army-style hand-to-hand combatives and self-defense training. They even had some training on the boat on the way over the Atlantic Ocean. He came over here with Margit Hilbig, which she turned out to be the first female black belt in Western Canada, or in Canada, period, actually. And according to her story, which I believe to be fairly accurate, when they came over, they first sparked interest in martial arts, Asian martial arts, from reading about them in magazines, like Black Belt magazine in the 1960s. And unbeknownst to them, you had to achieve a certification, and you had to be trained properly to be able to teach karate, for example, right?
So they learned what they could from magazines.
They learned what they could from magazines and started putting it together, and they started teaching people self-defense, and they formed their own schools. And at some point, as it grew in the U.S., Ed Parker, who was sort of a major influencer for Kempo karate and just martial arts in general, close friend of Bruce Lee as well. I'm not sure who reached out to who first, but Margit Hilbig, she started driving down to the States and training with Ed Parker in Los Angeles on a regular basis. She became very close to him, and then teaching his methods up here in Canada. And there was a bit of a divide there, whereas Master Simon, by the sounds of it, he just wanted to continue to do what he was doing, which was already monopolizing a new market in Canada, the pop culture of karate and kung fu. And if you look at any of his commercials, you guys should look at his commercials. They're on YouTube. You can find Temple Kung Fu commercials from up until the early 90s. Really? And you can tell by looking at them that they're pretty bogus, because he was obviously a businessman trying to sell a front for what martial arts, you could say exoticism of what the martial arts was. It's literally a Shaolin monk fighting a bunch of ninjas in a temple. That's what his 90s infomercial was.
It's sort of interesting, though, that so many different times and so many different places in the world, when there is an inception of some sort of martial art or martial arts culture, it has to start with a strong frontman. It has to start with somebody who gets the media interested in it and speaks about it like it's the end-all and really knows how to sell it to the general populace. You could say, to a certain degree, Helio Gracie was that guy back in the 1920s and 30s in Brazil.
Absolutely.
He was going around trying to prove to everybody as much as he possibly could, with every megaphone, with every public spectacle, that Gracie Jiu-Jitsu was the greatest martial art in the world. Yeah. And no matter what you think about that, you got to give it to him. If it wasn't for a character like that, it probably wouldn't have become what it has today.
That's right. In fact, the more I look into the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu history in Brazil, the more I see that it parallels the history of martial arts here in Alberta as well. Like you said, you have pioneers of a foreign martial art who are ultimately trying to make something new in a new country and make it catch. That ends up conflicting with the art when the world begins to modernize and become more interconnected. So come the age of the internet, Master Simon had to drop off the face of the earth, basically. And he moved out to build a temple in Grand Forks, BC, up in the mountains, where as far as I know, he lives in sort of like a commune up there, has a following, a religious following, and considers himself a religious leader. But back in the day, you know, what's crazy about him, and as a leader, is back in the day, and his level of charisma is obvious, because his character and the way he spoke was so confident, and he was highly intelligent, and he was physically an incredible athlete. And this man, like when my dad first met him, he saw him at a Klondike Days demonstration in downtown Edmonton, and he was apparently holding two hot rods together by their bumpers as they were peeling out and spinning on the pavement to get away. Now, there's a good chance that this is some kind of trick, right? There's probably a trick to it. There's a lot of things that he did that there's no trick to. You know, he smashed, I think it was like, I'm going to say it was over 1,000 pounds of ice with his forearm, and it broke his forearm in multiple places. He lit his arm on fire, apparently, and would douse the fire out and then peel flakes of skin off. And he even stuck a sword through his stomach and then pulled it back out. He did these kind of crazy things, I think, as a way to build up his reputation. Yeah, absolutely. But there were things that I know that people saw firsthand, including his sparring as well. Like, people said that he was incredibly good in the ring. Like, he was a very tough man. So all of that helped to build his reputation, right? But once people started to realize that his entire martial arts history was potentially fraudulent, and it was outed by the internet, you know, you couldn't do it anymore. But at one time, it was the Tiger Shamans of northwestern North America.
So the roots being as they were, it's interesting that there seems to be this typical, when you look back retrospectively, this typical evolutionary growth from a very charismatic, strange beginning to actual useful martial arts that tend to sort of go blade on blade with each other long enough to get an actual respectable style that is formidable in real world scenarios. We saw that with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as the history went on from the 20s up until now. We saw that, like you're saying, with Simon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Through the 60s, 70s, and now coming into the 90s, your dad not only has his own school, but he's well respected in the community. In fact, anybody that I talk to even today that's in the karate zeitgeist of Alberta, they know him by name and they know stories about him.
Yeah, yeah. So like I said, he was a rough and tumble guy, and he picked up martial arts very quickly and was able to apply it in competition. So he did fight in full contact karate. And that full contact karate transitioned through the 80s into kickboxing, right? What we call American kickboxing, which is basically they didn't do low kicks. So that was the cutting edge thing during the 80s was kickboxing. And when we opened this club here in 1999, the concept was a mixed martial arts concept. We already knew what the UFC was. Mixed martial arts wasn't a household term. It wasn't even a used term yet, but the idea was that we were going to have an eclectic system with a curriculum that included the grappling that he had learned through the years, added on to the kung fu and karate and kickboxing that we had learned. Muay Thai was also kind of starting to explode, and that became a different angle for kickboxing, right? So they included low kicks, they included more clinching. And over the years we started to grow, but what happened was, from 1999 through the 2000s, I was training and built up like a foundational fighting system for myself, but we weren't developing at a rate that the rest of the world was in terms of martial arts technology. And I didn't really realize that because I was still focused on learning what had already been laid out for me. Right? And I was under the impression that I knew at least 80% of what was out there to learn when it came to like fundamental paradigm of martial arts, right? I was so wrong. But I got my black belt when I was 17 in 2007 here. I put, hours and hours of training on these mats. And at some point in 2017, I wanted to like explore more into full contact karate, and it was something that wasn't popular here. It was kind of like a niche martial art. It would have been in 2007. Yeah. And
you know what's interesting, I'll interject here for a sec, is that the actual first time I ever met you before you started training at Genki Jiu-Jitsu was in a tournament that I had been training for maybe a year, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, I can't remember. But it was just this, talk about eclectic, there was every type of martial art that was going on there. It was hilarious that they just sort of jammed all the grappling styles over into the corner that everybody would forget about. I think there was 12 people there in total, all weight classes, all genders, all ages. And they just lined us all up, split us in the middle. You're all the lightweights, you're all the heavyweights. So there's two divisions, and they ran it on gymnastics mats, and not the gymnastics mats that you do in like the acrobatic gymnastics where it's a large square. It's like a runway that you would run down for a double mini to do like a springboard thing that was like fuzzy carpet. So we all walked away with rug burns all over our body because it was no-gi. And
you're expected to fight up and down on a two-dimensional plane like it's Mortal Kombat.
Exactly. And we're always rolling off the edges. It was only like about 7 feet, 8 feet wide. It's hilarious to think back on. But you were actually in my division, and I didn't even realize that until after I'd been training with you at Genki years later. And I looked back on some old pictures that came up on Facebook. I'm like, that's Logan. And you were in like a full black karate gi. And I was in like sprawl shorts and a no-name rash guard from Walmart.
I went against a guy and I got in the position for a heel hook. We weren't allowed to do heel hooks. This is like 2007 or 8, right? And so this is before I actually started like formal Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training.
And you just decided to jump into a grappling competition.
I did a few of them, from about 2004, and every year, a couple years, I'd try a grappling competition because at that time the grappling actually was pretty low level, right? And there wasn't a lot of serious skilled grapplers showing up at these competitions. But I remember, when I was going through my teenage years, like attempting these sort of, you know, these backwoods grappling competitions. And honestly, with all due respect for them, they were just people, they were just like karate people trying to create something new, trying to reach out a little bit and expand our horizons. And without that, we wouldn't have had that early experience here in Alberta, right?
Well, I saw the same thing with grappling tournaments back in the same time period. Is they would have pancration divisions, they would have Wing Chun divisions. They had what's the more full contact Chinese one?
Sanshao or
Sanshao divisions. Yep. Yeah, they would just sort of throw stuff out to see if it was interesting to people, and they'd pay to come do it.
Yep.
And I mean, I was in pancrase divisions when I didn't train striking for probably 3 years.
Yep. Exactly, right? So you kind of experienced something outside of the box, but that was also a big eye-opener for me because I was beginning to realize that, you know, grappling, I remember there was a wrestler that I went against in one competition, right? And he performed a 2-on-1 arm drag style takedown. And I remember asking, like, I remember going back to my dad and trying to figure out how we can block this 2-on-1 arm drag style takedown. There wasn't a good answer, right? I knew that the answers that we had were not going to suffice against the power of this takedown that I experienced. The way he set it up, the way he off-balanced me, it was too precise. This guy had been drilling an element of martial arts that I was completely unfamiliar with, right? And frankly, he was so good at takedowns that even like a BJJ purple belt would have had a hard time against this guy, I think. Like, he was really good. He came from a wrestling background, right? And then I would always pass it off as like, oh, you know what, well, I just lost at that particular area. But I began to realize that the whole area of grappling was a major area that had hugely begun to change over the years. And so I did travel to Japan, and I wanted to get into Kyokushin karate because it was a niche art, and I did. I learned under Hajime Nakata over there. And I ended up testing for black belt in Kyokushin karate and earning the black belt. And still, when I go back to Japan, I train with him as much as I can. But in 2010, I needed to completely change what I was doing in martial arts. I wanted to modernize what I was doing in martial arts. And I saw that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was the horizon for me.
Was that the year that you went out to Genki? It was 2010?
That was the year that I started at Genki.
Okay.
Yeah, so
I remember I was a blue belt, but it would have been like shortly after my blue belt, because it was like 2.5 years for me to blue, and I started in 2007, so I would have been like half a year, maybe a full year into blue by the time you showed up.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember I think I looked for Genki in the yellow pages, although I already knew the name from my dad. You know, it was a first suggestion that he came up with, and they were a strictly Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school, right? And I asked, honestly, on the phone what style of Jiu-Jitsu they were teaching, and Dave had said that we are a traditional Japanese, classically Japanese style, but we practice predominantly Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, and that was a very honest, open answer for me, and that's all I needed, right? I just wanted to train Jiu-Jitsu, and when I trained with you guys, you know, I rolled with you, and I was getting caught from inside closed guard. I was getting caught with arm bars and triangles all the time. So I was hugely open. And within that first year, I, to my own enjoyment, began to really involve myself with the idea that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu can shift the paradigm of martial arts to, if you're on the bottom, you can actually be in a control position. And that's something that I always saw the bottom guard, like it's not that we didn't train it, we had it, but it was not an ideal position to be in.
No, it's worst case scenario stuff, right?
Exactly. And because it was, what we were training was more, you'd say, Vale Tudo oriented Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. By the way, my dad even trained Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil for a little bit. Yeah, he went down to Brazil in 2002. And even back then, the stuff that he brought back, the photos that he's brought back, it looks kind of like catch wrestling stuff. It looks like luta libre stuff. Like it's a little bit more primitive looking jiu-jitsu, right? Even compared to today. So that's 20 years ago, and that just goes to show how much has changed even within Brazil. But yeah, starting at Genki, I wanted to get good at arm bars and triangles from the bottom because you were good at arm bars and triangles from the bottom. And I also wanted to learn how to survive them, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, no, I had a new rival in my life in you, and someone that I could pursue. And I actually had I had no intention, as you knew back then, of competing. Like I really didn't care about competition.
I had to kick your ass constantly when there was a tournament coming up to try to get you out, because me and Dave, we both knew that you were going to be a competition killer, but you weren't interested. Like you just weren't interested. You'd done your competition stuff with karate, and it was literal years before you finally decided to do it. And then, of course, you took off on it.
Yeah, I'd competed all throughout my childhood, and I really had no interest in competing. But I think what happened, well, initially there was a jiu-jitsu tournament that you went to, and you're like, hey, there's a pancration division, like you were saying, right? Yeah. 2004 pancration. I hadn't had a competition in a few years. 2014. I'm terrible with my years, but I hadn't had a competition in a couple of years. The last one was 2010 when I fought full contact in Japan in karate. And since then, I felt like that was sort of a pinnacle of like what I had pursued at that moment. And I had no reason to test myself. And another reason was because I was a white belt at Genki for a few years, right? Yeah. It was, as was discussed in the Roots episode, basically we had to struggle to legitimize ourselves and legitimize our belt structure. And I was getting my blue belt as that was happening, right? So we had to wait for me to get that legitimate blue belt. And I can't say that I wasn't interested in competing against white belts, but I wasn't interested in competing at white belt. You know what I mean? So I felt like once I achieved blue belt, which at Genki was like yellow, orange, green, and then blue. There's a ton of belts to go through in the traditional system. You threw this pancration idea at me, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to go into this pancration tournament, and I'm going to do some striking, because I kind of missed that, right? And I was like, I thought I was going to outstrike these guys and like land a head kick, but head kicks weren't allowed. Yeah. So I ended up, the first guy, I ended up submitting him with Ashigarami, like straight ankle lock from bottom when he swept me. And then the second guy, I outstruck him, but out-grappled him, and I utilized way more jiu-jitsu in the match than I expected. And I was like, okay, I actually am starting to transition my style into a jiu-jitsu oriented fighter, right? And it was within maybe a month after that I did my first jiu-jitsu competition as a jiu-jitsu player, right? Not as some guy that just came from a hodgepodge gym that had grappling in it. I was a jiu-jitsu player at that point. I understood jiu-jitsu. And I think I got silver at my first competition, and it was like, a month after that, I did another competition. A year later, I did several more competitions. I just went on a roll. You know, I was really starting to enjoy it. And I've never considered myself competitive, but I don't like losing, and I love winning. But mostly what it was that I saw opportunities to test myself, and the natural progression, if you're being honest with your own skill development, I began to realize has to be in competition. And then I never thought I'd compete at a world level ever, but the natural progression 10 years later has me there, you know. So I really enjoyed that jiu-jitsu pulled me back into competition as an adult.
Do you feel that competition is a necessary thing for people who do jiu-jitsu?
That's a really good question. For me, it is, because I am the type of person that wants to test myself. Even when I thought I wasn't competitive, I decided to do it, and I'm glad I did. There's people out there that they don't enter competitions, and it's primarily either because of fear or anxiety. That's all it mostly comes down to. If you really, really love your jiu-jitsu, or you really love martial arts, you're going to want to compete in it. Now, do you have to compete to be a decent fighter? No, you don't have to be. You don't have to be the best fighter in the world. You can learn how to fight, I think, just on the mats. But I think competition just brings you to another level. Every time I've trained for a competition, I feel like I surpassed a plateau that I didn't realize I was even at.
You know, it's funny when I think back on it, I hated doing competitions. I was nervous, I was a wreck, I was not good at making weight. Everything was just really awkward, and I don't know why I did it, because Dave never pushed it on anybody. But I started with one, and I was kind of like hooked to not losing. You know what I mean? I liked winning. Sure, it felt good to get a medal, but I hated losing more. And so anytime that even when I'd win and I didn't submit the guy, I didn't win. You know, I was supposed to submit him, time ran out, shoot. You know, I got to do better next time. And there was always this kind of like chasing my own tail. And I would force myself to go to every competition, not because I enjoyed competing, but because I was disappointed, or at least I knew I could do better at the next one, kind of thing. I feel like that was the snowball effect that kept me going into competitions. But it was interesting once you came on the scene at Genki, because I had a couple like gym rivals up to that point that just disappeared after a while. It was only like 2 or 3 years in by the time that you came in, but there wasn't anybody that was really pushing me in-house. I was kind of at that point the mat lion, and it was, you know, it is what it is. It was okay. I'd still come to classes every class of the week, but it wasn't like there was a reason to get better in-house, and then I would either do moderate or okay at a tournament, I'd be like, man, I got to do better kind of thing. But then when you came into the gym, like almost immediately within that first year, you and me you were my best training partner. And it was interesting because in the gym, I think it's super healthy to have at least one or two guys that you're like, I don't know what's going to happen in this match.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I remember what happened in the last match.
Yeah.
And you want to just get those incremental improvements, and you know that it's going to be a hard match.
Yeah.
And you know that you can't skip it, that every class you got to have at least one of those hard matches with that guy.
Yeah.
And then you flip it on its head when all of a sudden both of you are now going to tournaments, and it feels like everybody that we're releasing this weapon upon doesn't know what's about to hit them, because I've done the rounds in the gym, and like I was so excited to get you into tournament. I remember one specifically, there was an Alberta Provincials tournament. I think I was a purple belt at that point, and you were a blue, but between the gi, the no-gi...
I just got my purple.
Was that what it was?
Yeah,
okay.
2016
yeah, so we must
Provincials,
both been purple at that point, because I
Yeah.
didn't have my brown yet. There was like 4 divisions or 5 divisions between the two of us that we had entered into, between gi, no-gi, and absolutes. And between the two of us, we were the only 2 for Genki Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah.
We actually ended up getting enough team points in the no-gi to win the #1 team prize
Yeah.
for no-gi in the Alberta Provincial Championships with 2 guys.
Yeah, and if you were to go to Genki Dojo, like the week before that tournament, it was just you and me rolling for an hour straight, like nonstop, no timer, just we rolled for like an hour straight, and the buzzer went off in an hour.
Yeah.
I remember that. Yeah, but it goes to show it pays off. That was one of the proudest moments of my life, is because there's only 2 of us representing a team, and we still got a team trophy.
Yeah.
That's kind of unheard of.
I don't think I'm more proud of a single trophy than that cup, because it's not supposed to be possible. We were against teams of like 20, 30, 40. There's teams out there with over 100 competitors.
Yeah.
And they just didn't do the no-gi, Yeah. And we did well. You got like 3 golds. I think I got a gold and a silver, and that was enough.
Yep.
All right, so let's actually get to the modern day of what's going on with the dojo here. One thing we haven't even covered yet was the name of your dad's academy was the Chinese Boxing Connection.
That's right.
So you want to talk about something that speaks to the time period when it was created. Like the anything connection is so Hollywood for the 70s.
Yeah.
But Chinese boxing, there's so many question marks in my brain when that happens, but it has been that for decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, Chinese boxing, it's become an old name now in Alberta. Chinese Boxing Connection. The Chinese boxing element of it was the idea that what we did was striking mostly originally back in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And Chinese boxing was like a generic term for striking in China and also like other parts of Asia. So by extension, you could say Muay Thai or karate or anything that was...
So like American kickboxing, Chinese boxing.
Yeah, Chinese boxing. Actually, like it was a term from the 1800s that was referring to Asian martial artists.
Okay.
But the term's pretty outdated now because, so much of what I've learned from different ethnic areas of the world, right? Yeah. So much European stuff, Filipino influence, Brazilian influence, American influence, and we're Canadian. Mm-hmm. So, and the term was very confusing to people to explain it all the time. So what's now 1989? You come onto the scene, like you're born into 89, right? Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
And you're born into a martial arts family that has already been running a gym for decades at that point, and you get raised under a dad who's well known in the scene. You get your black belt at 17 years old under his style. You go to Japan, train in full contact karate championships there. Now, you've never actually run a gym yourself, though. Was there a reason up to this point? Because you're into your early 30s now.
Well, when I got my black belt here, I was teaching part-time.
Okay.
Yeah, and in fact, it got to the point where once I started at Genki, and I was training there twice a week, I was teaching here twice a week, and then usually doing one other thing kind of like somewhere else, whether it be Filipino Cali or Muay Thai or something, and I'd go out somewhere else and dabble in things here and there. But the 2 days a week that I'd teach here, I'd teach at least 1 day a week here, maybe 2 days a week here. So from about 2013 to 15, I was running the school most of the time. I was sort of a major instructor here. And then that's the reason why when my career changed and I moved to Calgary, I had to basically shut everything down here because there was no one here to take over a full-time teaching position. So you could say that I was the teacher at that point. But now that I'm back, so when I went to Calgary, I found my main gym in Kodokan YYC. And the Kodokan Jiu-Jitsu Club, run by the Chung brothers, by the time I had started there, I was a blue belt, and then just briefly a blue belt. I jumped immediately into purple belt when I was promoted after I got a blue belt absolute. And I went through purple, and now I'm at brown with the Chung brothers at the Kodokan Jiu-Jitsu Club. During that time, again, I had much more competitions. I played my hand at MMA successfully. And who knows, I might want to do that again. I probably want to do that again at some point. Like, honestly, that was one of the most fun things I've done in my life. But, and then I went down to Vegas and competed at World Masters 2019 and got bronze medal there. I submitted four opponents. Yeah, brown belt. Submitted 4 opponents and then lost on points on my 5th match. And since then, I competed in Japan at brown belt. I got absolute double gold. I got the gold and then the absolute gold, and then coming back to Canada, I competed at Peak Kumite. It was $1,000 for a $1,000 prize last year in Calgary, and I submitted my first opponent with a heel hook, got beat by my second opponent by armbar. I got caught with a Kimura armbar counter, and now I'm training to go to Nogi World Masters in October down in Dallas, Texas. But that was all leading up to ultimately what I want to do is reopen the gym here and open it under a different banner, but with the same spirit of what we always had. We were always an eclectic club that brought different martial arts together, but now I think the vision that my father originally had of having an ultimate mixed martial arts system, I'm beginning to develop that into fruition even more. So it's just a continuation of the process. I wanted to come up with a name that paid homage to the Chinese boxing connection, and the connection part had a strong philosophical concept, how it was the connection between yin and yang. It was a connection between like hard and soft, connection between striking and grappling styles, and the connection between warriors. We wanted a place where different people with different fighting styles could come and just practice combat sports or self-defense in an area where they weren't considered judged for whatever their background was. And I want to just keep that going here in Innisfail. There's not a huge demographic for martial arts in this area. It's a fairly rural area. I want to tap into that and open up under the name Seibukan Connection. And the Seibukan is the name of the dojo I practice karate at in Japan. I love the name. It means the virtuous warriors, house of virtuous warriors. And the philosophy behind Seibukan was that martial arts is about personal development. I've got a wealth of knowledge that I want to teach. I have my dad's gym sitting here, and it's a privilege that I'm able to use it.
Well, I think it's just a beautiful story that continues on. You know, yeah. I feel like it would have been. I know that there's some people have feelings about things being foisted onto them by the previous generation, like you have to carry on your father's business. But this feels like it would have been a shame if it had ended.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's a legacy that needs to continue, and it's a legacy of change. It's a legacy of development, and that's the exciting part, right?
I got nothing but high hopes, and I'm sure that you'll even surpass them for once you open up your own club here. So I'm excited to hear the stories that come from that. And Logan, I just want to thank you for the time you've taken out of your life here today, and honestly for all of the training that you've given me over the years. There's so much that I've learned from you as a student, as even movements and instructions that you brought into the club from outside that you transmitted to me and back and forth. It's just, you're a part of my history too. And I love every moment that we've been able to train together, and I'll miss you while I'm out on the road, man.
Thanks, brother. I'll miss you too.
I'm a big fan of origin stories, so I'm really excited about what's going to happen with Seibukan Connection in Innisfail. Logan, I have absolutely no doubt, is going to be a phenomenal teacher, that his students are going to be very blessed in everything that he can transmit to them. Now, I don't know if you can hear in the background, there's a lot of noises where I'm recording. That one there, I believe, is a cicada, which we don't actually have where I'm from. And you might be wondering, where exactly am I right now? Well, that's going to be a story for the next couple episodes.